Hi, Amanda Hobson here. I'm going to be reading from Queering the Vampire Narrative, co-edited by myself and Melissa Anwio. And I'm going to be reading from the introduction called Queer Vampires, Queering the Vampire, and the Transgressive Undead, and Introduction. As we embark on this third text exploring the vampire's liminal positioning as cultural outsider, this icon continues to inhabit spaces of contradiction, living but undead, anachronistic while transgressive, powerful yet weakened by their natures. The vampire endures via its preternatural ability to hold our cultural interests throughout visual media, popular culture, and scholarly analysis, in part due to the increasing production of vampire tales by creators with marginalized and minoritized identities. These iterations seem to be growing more diverse. Vampires operate as metaphors for our fears and desires and for our concerns about transgressing cultural norms. As we've previously argued, thus the vampire functions in a multiplicity of ways depending on the cultural positioning of its creation, the ways a particular generation views itself, but in all iterations, it reflects our desires, concerns, and while reflecting our solutions to the problem of the day. And further, the vampire is a sociocultural lens through which we can examine lenses of justice and identity, and one whom we recognize quite clearly as the most familiar monster because they share our faces. Yet they operate as disconcerting mirrors of humanity. End quote. In our conversations about this project of queering the vampire narrative, we've consistently returned to the ways that they are subtextual readings of queer identity within the vampire tale. But also, and for us most importantly, the ways that the vampire is always inherently queering norms, boundaries, identities, and cultures. In this way, we turn to Cassandra Snow's Queering the Tarot, 2019, for a helpful approach to the concept of queering. Quote, queering something means taking what our society has given us and finding our own way outside of that society's limits. They put us in a box and we still find a way to create and prosper and make it the most well-decorated box you'll see. Queering erases the narrowness and small-mindedness of normal. It embraces the beauty, the mystery, and the vastness of our differences. It welcomes everyone who needs a safer space, and it takes responsibility for helping those people heal, end quote. Thus, queering the vampire reinforces the explosion/implosion of the narrowness of the normative boxes created by sociocultural expectations. Moreover, the nature of the vampire has bonded tightly to queer identities and queer ideologies. Vampire scholarship consistently refers to underlying themes of queerness within mainstream vampire narratives. This perception that sexual diversity is simply an undertone grows from the way more traditional vampire tales articulate queer behavior as incidental to the vampire's need to feed, rather than the potentiality of the undead's embrace of sexual fluidity. And yet, vampires that unsettle gender and sexuality have been the key to the icon of the vampire. These queered readings of the subtextual transgressions demonstrate ongoing cultural pressures to maintain normative identity boundaries. I'm going to skip ahead, so give me 1 second. Thus, the bulk of vampire texts have created a consistent message of the vampire as marker for a sexually different creature that sublimates queer identity to same-gender sexual behavior. Meaning, in many tales, queerness is often at best a spectacle to watch and at worst a perversity to revile and eradicate. These representations, which do not require the characters to verbalize their sexual orientation, could be read as transgressive, but in the end, they fall short. For many, identification as gender and sexual minorities can be a politically loaded and difficult quandary. Given the relative privileges and punishments of coming out, this is a central conflict for many LGBTQIAP+ individuals who may gain one community, lose another, and ultimately must continually grapple with choosing between living authentically or safety. And no matter the individual choice, there are always ongoing consequences. The 2020s are a time in which many countries, communities, and individuals frame queerness as the abnormal, creating barriers and dangers for queer and trans folks. And we sit in a moment in which many states within the United States are debating and enacting anti-queer and anti-trans legislation. The act of coming out, of naming oneself as queer and trans, and of creating openly queer content is by its nature a political act within our current context of heteronormativity and cisnormativity. Queer theory articulates the idea that queer demonstrates an action. Theorists like Judith Butler argue queer is a verb and it indicates doing rather than being. Gender and sexuality are performative. They're performative in the sense that gender and sexuality are enacted through engaged perceptions and behavioral cues that are often pronounced. The naming of sexuality creates the action of producing that sexuality, and more, the enactment of sexuality crafts the ongoing reimagining of the language, visual, and verbal of sexuality. Acceptance, perception, identification, and enactment are the heart of performing gender and sexuality. So too is an ongoing experimentation, a flirtation with unraveling the normativity of sexuality. Many mainstream vampire narratives highlight only the incidental, accidental, or situationally queer vampire. The patterns of these vampires is that they participate in survival queerness, driven by their need to feed, an act made sexual by its intimacy, which we skew as sexual in our repressive sexual culture, thus making the act of feeding queer. To a certain degree, this type of representation can be helpful because people who identify as queer can see characters engaged in queer sexual behaviors, but this is still regressive, as it indicates that queerness is a function that could be corrected with more appropriate circumstances. Subtextual queerness in vampire narratives easily becomes a rich source for us as scholars to dig into cultural norms, fears, and representations. So as scholars, we embrace these subtexts for exploration because they allow our personal narratives to read into them. I am again skipping ahead. With the diversification in the representation of the vampire, the depth of it as an icon of the other grows as representative of the expansion of our understanding about gender, sexual, and relationship diversity, specifically demonstrating that these identity categories are not stable monoliths. In part, this inclusion and expansion of the vision of the openly queer vampire in publishing and film. Oh, sorry, I skipped a line. I apologize. In part, this inclusion and expansion of the vision of the openly queer vampires fit within the current movement calling for #own voice representation in publishing and film. The importance of own voices is that it means not only more choices for readers and viewers, but also that we are seeing beyond the singular normative vision of identity to the nuances of the intersectionality of identity and oppression. With own voices narratives, we see an embrace of the idea that diverse representation allows not only people to see themselves, but to see people who are different from themselves, which queers the normative cultural gaze that we are trained to see. People from culturally minoritized groups have always been asked to cross-identify with characters from majoritized ones. But in own voice stories, people with majoritized identities are now asked to cross-identify. It helps shape our ideas, including our biases, about who are different from us. With these own voice vampire stories, creators embrace the diverse identities and communities that represent their lived experiences of LGBTQIAP+ people. While the own voice hashtag is relatively recent phenomenon, the calls for representation are not, and queer artists and authors have been writing vampire tales representing intersectional issues through queer vampires for some time. For instance, we'll point to Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories as a foundational queer Black feminist vampire narrative addressing issues of racism, enslavement, sexism, and violence. And I'm just going to read the conclusion and then I'm going to wrap up my reading. So again, maybe check out the introduction. So to end, throughout this text, the contributors of this text grapple with the philosophically and culturally established confines of binaries, boundaries, and limitations, particularly the identity boxes in which we find ourselves placed. To queer our identity and our cultural examinations means to engage in a process of disarticulating normativity and creating new visions of power, pleasure, and identity. As we've explored, the vampire is always already queer. By embracing the socio-political cultural power of queerness, we espouse an impulse to unmoor ourselves from the norm. Michael Warner writes, quote, "The preference for queer represents, among other things, an aggressive impulse of generalization. It rejects a minoritizing logic of toleration or simple political interest representation in favor of a more thorough resistance to regimes of the normal. For academics, being interested in queer theory is a way to mess up and the desexualized spaces of the academy. Exude some rut, reimagine the publics from or for which academic intellectuals write, dress, and perform," end quote. In this vein, we return time and again to the ultimate queer icon, the vampire. The vampire continues to mess up our disciplinary rigidity and waltzes through our attempt to create neat genre delineations. Even in the most repressive and prudish contexts, the vampire cannot help but ooze sexuality, even if it's a sexuality pushing at pain, pleasure dynamics, and other types of sexuality. The vampire bleeds all over our attempts at neatness. And in the vampire's messiness, vampire scholars get to explore, create, and imagine. Thank you.